What is going on, everyone? It is the pregame show with Mark Rossano and David Ramsden Wood. Mark, how are you today?
Now that things are starting to correct a little, I feel a little bit better and justified with some of the views that I've had for the last few weeks. But it's a little too late, I guess.
In a way, you must feel like Galileo when he was coming out against the church saying that the earth actually revolved around the sun, and everyone's like, no, that doesn't make any sense. Then like, actually it does make sense, but we just don't want to tell everybody. So right. The last time I was on, it's been a couple weeks, I took a total break from social media and the news. I grew a beard. I look like I could live in the bushes, just like living off the land with some regenerative farming. But I couldn't. So catch me up on what's going on. I'm seeing India cases exploding. I see news coming out of OPEC with the EIA. S&P's at 41.28 as of today. Mark, let's start with India. What on earth is happening?
Sure. Well, it's great to have you back. Hopefully you're nice and rejuvenated after watching the nonsense that we've seen bounce around. But some of the big things that are coming out of India now is, Modi is going to address the nation. It's happening now based on timing. The push is, they had to shut down the largest state on an economic level in the country because of COVID cases. On a global level, we've now reached a new record on COVID, and it's really being driven by Asia, with obviously the largest piece of that being India. So the view is that we're going to get another lockdown, that we're going to get some additional restrictions within India, which is going to hurt demand. And for those that have been following along, India is also one of the largest creators and exporters of the pharma industry. So there's some concern in terms of, well, what is this going to do to the vaccine rollout? Not so much for the U.S., but for the emerging markets where they were supposed to deliver a large part of their drugs.
So I follow Ben Hunt. I disagree on some of his things, but I really like him. And he's been talking also, we've seen cases going up in Iran. We've seen cases spiking, but generally the U.S., which leads the world for all intents and purposes, economically, decisions, we're 50% vaccinated in terms of first shots of those who are eligible. Do you think that this is different than 365 days ago, which is the anniversary of our negative $37.63 oil? But it was the U.S. locking down in March that really led to a whole bunch of follow-on activities, I think, in the world. Do you think that U.S. activity picking up, vaccinations rolling up, are going to make people less restrictive? Yet in Canada, Ontario's announced the most severe restrictions in North America fully. So how does that balance?
I think right now you can turn to Israel, and Israel, I think, is a good sample set for the effectiveness of having certain amount of restrictions and not big restrictions, just a certain amount of masking, just being smart with washing your hands, distancing, not trying to spit on each other. But the vaccines is a huge component to it. And the pushback has been, what is the effectiveness? Should we be concerned about the effectiveness? But we all know that if you're vaccinated, if you do get it, you are not going to the hospital. If you have a comorbidity, it's no longer a death sentence. So you're seeing a lot of those restrictions on the infrastructure being pulled back, which then allows for a certain amount of reopening, a certain amount of activity to continue as normal, even though we have seen some cases like in Michigan, they started to increase. You had some stress on the ICU side, but not to the level that we had in March, specifically speaking in New York, where people weren't really sure what was happening. Now we know what the virus is. We know what it's doing. We know how to treat it. We have, drugs to treat it. We have a vaccine that we know is effective against it. So it is different this time. The question then comes down to, do you have access to the vaccine? And that's where we start coming down to those haves and have-nots, which is why the issues within India become a bigger problem for the emerging market world, because they were relying on them for a large part of their vaccine dosages that were going to come down through those supply channels.
If you get a chance, we'll pivot off of India, but if you get a chance, I will recommend the movie White Tiger, which is, I believe, on Netflix, and it is an exceptional view into what it would be like to be a very poor Indian. And I put it in context of first world problems or climate change, and when you don't know where your next meal is coming from, you give absolutely none of the Fs about CO2 emissions. I do think about the same construct in terms of 800 million people in India, very impoverished relative relative to us and their access to healthcare and their living quarters and everything. India is a very interesting case study in terms of what you can do for a culture that is so bifurcated, and it'll be something to watch. Let's pivot to OPEC because Saudi has done a yeoman's job since January, where they've moved oil effectively from 49 to 65. We had a little bit of weakness while I took my break. I come back, I open it today, it's 63, but down. So where is OPEC at? What's going to happen in May? How does Indian demand impact things right now? What are you seeing out of OPEC?
Well, right now, I think Saudi Arabia is struggling a bit to figure out how do they work themselves back into the market and try to take some of that market share back that they've lost or that they've seen pivot away from them at this point in time. So I think that we're not going to see a deviation in May. We're going to start to see a bit more activity. They do have some credibility when they're saying that they are going to consume more because you're coming into summer. The Middle East gets very hot. They use oil to increase their electrical capacity. So there is that piece to it where they're going to see some of this growth on an internal level. But externally, they're concerned about Iran. There's commentary back out about things going well in Vienna. Not to say that it matters right now because Iran is saying that they're 60 to 70% of the way. But we all know from looking at the original nuclear deal, with a large part of it being done under Bush, crossed the finish line under Obama because there was one big sticking point: ballistic missiles. What is that going to mean? So we can get to 95%, but that last 5% could keep us delayed for years. But again, it's a headline. We're at levels that really can't be supported based on physical pricing. Everyone keeps talking about this great reopening, but we are reopening. We're in the middle of reopening. We've been reopening. And now you're starting to see that gasoline demand, temper a bit. And it's not that it's going to fall, it's just going to stagnate, which is what we've started to see. I think the Gas Buddy guys have done a very good job of highlighting that. We've seen it with the EIA. And then the question is going to be, when do we start to see some of this growth come back? And summer is going to be stronger, as it always is. It's just not going to be what it was in 19 or 18.
Do you see the U.S. producer having learned? I feel sometimes I've stopped on my blog. I'm not writing as much about oil and gas because, to be honest, for the last 2 years, I feel like everything that could be written should have been written or was written. Stop growing production, consolidate assets, reduce G&A, reduce debt, stay flat, manage prices, and hedge. Those have been the things I've been writing about for 2 years. Yet we've seen the rig count climb. We've seen the frac count climb. We hear a lot of optimism out of some of the companies in conference calls. Where do you think the U.S. producer lands given the volatility, seeing what's going on in India? Are they going to just ignore all the lessons of the past, or are we in a different place?
I think we're in a little bit of a different place, and we're seeing some guys learn, and we're not going to see the same robust moves. But there's two sides to that. There's one, the liquid side, condensate continues to be strong. We continue to see strong pricing across the board. So you're going to see some of that support, but there's also a quality of the rock problem where, how much of the good stuff has been drilled up. So are we going to need to see a bit more activity to see a little bit of growth? And I think we're starting to get into this world where it's not quite tier one. It's kind of tier two, but not really. And we're starting to see this bifurcation in terms of the haves and have-nots with public versus private. The private companies don't have the same type of constraints. They don't have the same type of shareholders. They have to make maybe 1, 2, 3 people happy and agree with their projects. And again, when you're private, you're producing less. It's easier for a private company to hedge versus Conoco. That's just the way it goes, which is why a lot of the integrateds were integrated. They didn't have to hedge as much because they controlled more of the supply chain. Or it's really a natural hedge, if you will. So when you look at some of the growth projects and where things are going, it's not going to be this explosive 13 million. It's going to be let's stop the decline curve. We've done it. Now let's get back to 11.5, where I think we're starting to see some of that steady mobility. But to your point on rigs, again, everybody's adding rigs in the Permian, but we've gone through a lot of the DUCs in the Bakken, in the Eagle Ford, and in order to really start to see some of that growth in those two regions, we're going to need to see some of that rig activity come back to replenish what we've worked through over the last 18 months or so.
Last question for you before we close. DAPL. So we saw about April 9th, I believe, that the Corps of Engineers came out and said that they're not going to actively shut the pipeline. The judge came out and said, I'm going to give you 10 days to make a case as to why you should leave the pipeline open. The market has generally interpreted that as it's going to be left open. I kind of believe that it is too. I'm curious your view and what risks remain around DAPL and the larger implications of what happens when you get a permit in the United States to do something. You do it for 3 years and then you undo it, costing a lot of shareholders money. Where do we fall in that balance?
So I agree with you. I don't think there's going to be enough to shut it down. I think it'll be allowed to run until I think they have until next year this time to redo the environmental impact study. So you're going to see that operate, which will bring some frac spreads back, because right now we don't have enough activity there to keep production flat. So we've seen that pretty steady decline over the last, pretty much over the last 8 months. And on a seasonal level, this is when you start going back, because it's still snowing in North Dakota. So
and cold. If you've ever been in North Dakota in January, I'm going to tell you, minus 40, not super comfortable.
No, and that's with the wind chill. So the wind chill just makes it all the more painful. So when you look at what's happening, I think at this point you're going to see that stand. The issue is going to come down to, well, how do we create an effective environmental impact study and these, like to your point, different types of approvals that will stand the test of time. And the problem was things were done wrong on both sides. And there was some error that we need to learn from and say, look, we really can't do this the way we did. We have to be respectful. But at the same time, once we've approved it, it has to stay in approval, because people are going to plan around that. And it's not even just the shareholders on the pipeline side. It's the E&Ps, it's the restaurants, it's the buildings, it's everything that has built around that ecosystem that we need to appreciate. Now, if it does shut down, do things end? No. Well, there'll be more crude on rail. There'll be more competition for the available pipeline capacity. So you'll see differentials move, but you won't see the production. It just won't be a growth spot. It'll just be like, how do we kind of keep the treadmill going without overtaxing the infrastructure?
Yeah, it certainly seems like it will be an increased expense, which ultimately will pass on to consumers. But also, I think it would impact the Canadian production, simply because you're going to have a lot of demand for rail cars, where crude is currently on pipelines at 500,000 barrels a day. That's a lot of trains that you need, that then takes away the ability for Canadian crude to get to market. It will be interesting. Now, let's close. We don't usually talk about politics, and I wouldn't say that this is political per se, but the Derek Chauvin trial wound up Monday of this week. I saw images of Minneapolis boarding up cities. I think it's very fair to say, if there's anything less than the maximum, and quite frankly, even if there is the maximum, I think we can have a strong expectation that there will be riots and violence. What comes out of that politically for the Democrats, those mayors in power, the BLM movement? This is a huge week going back 11 months when we had the George Floyd event and the subsequent riots. What do you make of it?
So I think that there's a lot of anger and frustration that's been building up over the last decade, really. There's a lot to be said about the way that individuals are treated in terms of how do the police enforce against certain minorities? How do the minorities treat the police? And then at the same time, when you look underneath it, where is the inequality? Where is the frustration without the ability to advance? And all of a sudden you get these pressures that are mounting, and people are trying to find an outlet, and they're grabbing onto something as that outlet to say, like, look, this was wrong, and I'm going to get my frustration out. When you look at the riots in general, they sparked from one thing, and to be fair, a lot of those those protests were peaceful for, police brutality, when things with George Floyd happened. But then as the night progressed and people became restless, they used that as a means of showing their frustration, it taking out what we've seen. And it's something similar to what we saw in the 70s. We had a lot of political pressure. We saw a lot of sit-ins through the 60s and 70s. And then we had the problems in the 70s with inflation and people unable to move, social classes. And then you had the New York blackout, and people went nuts. It became a shopping spree that then created this backdrop of low growth. And I think we're starting to see that. And while people may not see the correlation between what happened in DC and what continues to happen there's a big problem at the underlying foot of it all, which is lack of social mobility, a growing inequality. We see it time and time again with the 1%, top 10% versus the rest of America. And let's be fair, this is a global problem. This is not just a U.S. issue. The middle class has been just obliterated through COVID and with the central bank activities and what we continue to see. Like, one of the big things that we're also seeing is inflation with food. What does it mean for food? You talk about, things rising in Iran on a COVID level, in India, but what about food? We joke about everyone's focused on carbon capture, but in Nigeria, they're knocking over grain silos because they can't eat. So when you look at these things that are happening, it's not just happening in the U.S., it's everywhere. It's just people are using a rallying cry. And then from there, you see this upheaval that that is connected to, but only in a loose way, what the actual protest started at.
Well, it is good to be back with you, Mark. Thank you for your thoughts today. We covered India, we covered OPEC, we covered the U.S. oil and gas, we covered the Derek Chauvin trial. I look forward to next week. Follow all of the videos that will be coming out with Primary Vision this week on EIA and the Economy Show. And as always, I am David Ramsden-Wood, and for Mark Rossano, thank you for joining us. Have a great day.
Thanks, and welcome back, David. It's nice to have you back.
Good to be back.